3 unnerving true neighbor horror stories. What if the person living next door isn't who they claim to be? What if the friendly wave across the fence hides something far more sinister? Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 deeply disturbing true stories that will make you think twice about who you're living next to. In our first story, a young woman discovers her neighbor has been entering her apartment while she's away, but what he's been doing inside will make your blood run cold. Then a family moves into their dream home, only to realize their neighbor has been watching their every move through hidden cameras. And finally, a college student's upstairs neighbor's midnight rituals lead to a discovery so horrifying, the entire apartment complex had to be evacuated. These aren't urban legends. These aren't creepypastas. These are real events that happen to real people, and they serve as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters don't hide under our beds. They live right next door. Before we begin, if you're a fan of true horror stories, make sure to subscribe to Dark Whispers and hit that notification bell so you never miss a terrifying tale. And if you make it to the end of this video, let me know in the comments which story disturbed you the most. Now turn down your lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into these 3 unnerving true neighbor horror stories. Story 1. The apartment next door. Sarah Mitchell had finally done it. At 26 years old, she'd saved enough money to move out of her cramped studio and into a decent 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Portland. The building was old but charming, with high ceilings and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The rent was affordable, the neighborhood was safe, and her new place was only a 15-minute walk from her office. There was only one thing that gave her pause during the apartment tour: her neighbor. The man in Unit 4B, directly across the hall from her new home in 4A, had opened his door just as Sarah and the landlord were leaving. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with thinning hair and pale, almost translucent skin. What struck Sarah most were his eyes. They were a watery blue that seemed to look right through her. "This is Marcus Webb," the landlord had said with forced cheerfulness. "He's been here for about 8 years. Very quiet tenant." Marcus had smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the building," he'd said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." Something about the way he said it made Sarah's skin crawl, but she pushed the feeling aside. She was being paranoid. The apartment was perfect, and she wasn't going to let one awkward neighbor ruin it for her. Sarah moved in on a Saturday in September. Marcus was nowhere to be seen, and she was grateful for that. Over the next few weeks, she settled into her new place, decorating it with furniture from thrift stores and prints from local artists. She fell in love with her morning routine, making coffee while watching the sunrise through her bedroom window, the city slowly waking up below her. She didn't see much of Marcus, which was fine by her. Occasionally, she'd hear his door open or close, catch a glimpse of him shuffling down the hallway, but they rarely spoke beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement. Then, about a month after moving in, Sarah started noticing small things that seemed off. It began with her coffee mug. She always left it in the same spot on the counter, to the right of her coffee maker. One morning, she came out of the shower to find it had been moved to the left side. She stood there, dripping water on the floor, staring at the mug with a growing sense of unease. She must have moved it herself and forgotten, she reasoned. She'd been tired lately, working long hours. But then it happened again. And again. The mug would be in different positions. Sometimes on the opposite counter, once even in the dish drainer, though she distinctly remembered leaving it out. Other things started happening too. Her bedroom door, which she always left open a crack, would sometimes be fully closed when she got home. Books on her shelf would be in slightly different positions. Once, she could have sworn her underwear drawer had been rifled through, though nothing appeared to be missing. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid, that she was just stressed from work and not paying attention to what she was doing. But deep down, a terrible suspicion was growing. Someone had been in her apartment. The thought was almost too frightening to entertain. She lived on the 4th floor of a secured building. All the windows had locks, and she always deadbolt her front door when she left. There was no way someone could be getting in, unless they had a key. That thought hit her like a punch to the gut. She stood in her living room, looking around at her space, and suddenly it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt violated, contaminated. Sarah decided to test her theory. Before leaving for work one morning, she carefully positioned several small items in specific ways that she would remember. A pen on her desk pointed at a 45-degree angle toward the window, a hand towel in the bathroom folded in thirds instead of half, her bedroom slippers placed exactly parallel to each other beside her bed. When she came home that evening, her hands were shaking as she unlocked her door. She went to each spot she'd marked. The pen had been moved. The towel was folded in half. The slippers were askew. Someone had definitely been in her apartment. Sarah's first instinct was to call the police, but what would she tell them? That her coffee mug had been moved? That her slippers weren't quite parallel anymore? They'd think she was crazy. She needed proof. The next day, Sarah went to an electronics store and bought a small wireless security camera. It was designed to look like a regular alarm clock, and it could be accessed remotely from her phone. She set it up on her dresser, angled to capture most of her bedroom, including the doorway. If someone came in, she'd have video evidence. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept checking the camera feed on her phone, watching her empty bedroom, jumping at every small noise in the building. But nothing happened. Her apartment remained still and undisturbed. The next day at work, Sarah found herself obsessively checking the camera feed every few minutes. Everything looked normal. Maybe she really had been imagining things. Maybe she was just stressed and... At 11:47 a.m., her bedroom door slowly opened. Sarah's heart stopped. She watched, frozen, as a figure stepped into view. It was Marcus. Her neighbor Marcus was in her apartment, in her bedroom, in the middle of the day while she was at work. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking around her room with an expression of deep contentment on his face. Then he walked slowly to her bed and sat down on it, running his hands over her comforter. He laid back, stretching out on her bed, and closed his eyes. Sarah thought she might throw up. She was watching this man, this stranger, lying in her bed in her private space, and she was powerless to stop it. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped her phone. Marcus lay there for nearly 10 minutes. Then he got up, walked to her dresser, and opened her underwear drawer. Sarah watched in horror as he picked up a pair of her underwear, held them to his face, and inhaled deeply. He pocketed them. Then he did something even more disturbing. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Pictures of her room, her bed, her personal items. He took a selfie of himself lying in her bed. Then he opened her closet and photographed her clothes. After about 20 minutes total, Marcus left, carefully closing the bedroom door behind him to the exact position it had been in before. Sarah sat at her desk, trembling, feeling like she might pass out. She immediately called the police. The responding officers took her statement and viewed the video footage. They were visibly disturbed by what they saw. They went to Marcus's apartment, but he wasn't home. They told Sarah they would issue an arrest warrant for breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and burglary. Sarah couldn't stay in her apartment another night. She called her sister, who lived across town, and asked if she could stay there for a while. As she was frantically packing a bag, there was a knock at her door. She looked through the peephole and saw Marcus standing there. Her blood turned to ice. He knocked again, more insistently this time. "Sarah," he called through the door, his voice that same unsettling whisper. "I know you're in there. I need to talk to you." Sarah grabbed her phone, ready to call 911. "I know you found the camera," Marcus continued. "That's okay. I'm not angry. I just want you to understand, I've been so lonely for so long, and you made me feel alive again. Having you here, being close to you, it's all I have." Sarah's hands shook as she dialed 911. "I have copies of your key," Marcus said, and Sarah heard a jingling sound. "Keys? I could come in right now if I wanted to. But I won't. Not if you promise to let me keep visiting. We can share the space, Sarah. I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm there." The 911 operator answered, and Sarah whispered frantically about what was happening. Marcus must have heard her voice because his tone suddenly changed. "You called the police again? You sounded hurt, betrayed. After everything we've shared? After I've been so careful not to disturb you?" Sarah heard him trying his keys in her lock, but she'd already thrown the deadbolt. He couldn't get in. "Open the door, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Open the door right now." She could hear him getting agitated, could hear him throwing his weight against the door. The police operator told her to stay on the line, that officers were on the way. I said, "Open the door." Marcus screamed, and Sarah had never heard such rage in someone's voice. He was pounding on the door now, kicking it, and she could see the frame starting to splinter. Just as the door looked like it might give way, Sarah heard shouting in the hallway, "Police! Step away from the door." There was a scuffle, more shouting, and then silence. The police had arrived just in time. When they finally told Sarah it was safe to come out, she opened her door to find Marcus face down on the hallway floor, hands cuffed behind his back. He turned his head to look at her, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger anymore. It was sadness, longing, like she was breaking his heart by rejecting him. "I loved you," he whispered as they hauled him to his feet. "I loved you so much." The police searched Marcus's apartment with Sarah's permission to look for her stolen property. What they found was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The walls of Marcus's bedroom were covered, completely papered, with photos of Sarah. Pictures of her coming and going from the building, pictures of her at the coffee shop down the street, pictures of her at work that he must have taken from outside the building, and hundreds of pictures from inside her apartment. Sarah sleeping in her bed, showering, changing clothes, walking around in her underwear. He'd been documenting her life for the entire month she'd lived there. But it got worse. In his closet, they found a dress on a mannequin, one of Sarah's dresses that had gone missing a week ago. The mannequin wore a wig that matched Sarah's hair color and style. Next to it was a small shrine with more photos of Sarah, along with items he'd stolen from her apartment. The missing underwear, a used coffee cup, a hairbrush, a pillowcase. In his bathroom, police found a toothbrush that DNA testing later confirmed had been Sarah's. He'd been using it. The detective who processed the scene told Sarah that in his 15 years on the force, this was one of the most disturbing cases of obsession he'd ever seen. Marcus Webb was charged with multiple felonies, including stalking, breaking and entering, burglary, and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, police discovered that Sarah wasn't his first victim. In the 8 years Marcus had lived in that building, 3 other young women had occupied apartment 4A. All of them had moved out within months, complaining of feeling unsafe, of things being moved in their apartments, of feeling watched. None of them had reported it because they couldn't prove anything was happening. The landlord admitted that he'd suspected Marcus might be entering the apartments but hadn't done anything about it because Marcus always paid his rent on time and he didn't want the hassle of evicting a long-term tenant. Marcus's attorney tried to argue that his client had mental health issues and needed treatment rather than prison. But the prosecutor had the photos, the videos, the shrine, and a very credible victim. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Sarah never went back to that apartment. She broke her lease and the landlord didn't fight her on it. He was probably afraid she'd sue him for negligence. She moved to a different part of the city, into a building with better security and on-site management. But the damage was done. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She installed cameras in every room of her new apartment. She changed her daily routine constantly, never following the same pattern twice. She couldn't drink coffee anymore without remembering her mug being moved. She couldn't sleep without checking her closet, under her bed, behind the shower curtain. The therapist she started seeing told her this was a normal response to trauma, that it would take time to feel safe again. But Sarah wondered if she'd ever truly feel safe. Because she now knew something that most people are lucky enough never to learn. That the person living right next door to you, the one you see in the hallway and exchange polite nods with, could be harboring the darkest obsessions. Could be studying you, learning your patterns, finding ways into your most private spaces. Sarah still lives in fear that one day Marcus will be released from prison. And when that day comes, will he remember her? Will he try to find her? These are the questions that wake her up at 3 a.m., her heart pounding, checking her security cameras, making sure all her locks are secured. Because the scariest part of this entire experience wasn't the month of intrusion, wasn't even the confrontation at her door. It was realizing that for 4 weeks, while she slept, while she lived her life, while she felt safe in her own home, Marcus had been there too, watching her, touching her things, lying in her bed. That violation of her most intimate spaces, the place where she was supposed to feel safest, was something she would carry with her forever. And she wasn't alone in this experience. The 3 other women who'd lived in that apartment before her had suffered the same violation, but they'd never known the full truth of what was happening to them. They just felt that creeping sense that something was wrong, had moved out and tried to forget about it. How many other people, Sarah wondered, are living next door to their own Marcus Webb right now? How many people are feeling that nagging sensation that something isn't quite right in their home, that things aren't where they left them, that they're being watched? And how many of them will dismiss those feelings as paranoia, never installing that camera, never getting that proof, and continue living with a predator who has the key to their front door? That's the truly terrifying thing about Sarah's story. Marcus Webb isn't unique. He's not a 1 in a million monster. He's someone who lived in an ordinary apartment building for 8 years, paid his rent on time, and seemed like a quiet, harmless neighbor. He could be anyone. He could be anywhere. He could be living right next to you. Story 2, The Watcher Next Door. When the Henderson family, Michael, Jennifer, and their 2 children, Emma and Tyler, bought their dream house in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, they thought they'd finally made it. After years of saving and apartment living, they'd found a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with a big backyard, perfect for their growing family. Emma was 7, Tyler was 5, and both kids were thrilled to finally have their own rooms. The house was in a quiet neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates, the kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street and neighbors hosted block parties. It seemed perfect. Their next-door neighbors were an older couple, the Richardsons, Harold and Diane. They'd lived in their house for over 30 years and seemed pleasant enough when the Hendersons first met them. Harold was a retired accountant, Diane a former teacher. They brought over a casserole on moving day, welcomed the family to the neighborhood, and told them not to hesitate to ask if they needed anything. "We're so happy to have a young family next door," Diane had said, smiling warmly. "It'll be nice to hear children laughing again." The first few months were blissful. The kids adjusted well to their new school, Michael's commute wasn't too bad, and Jennifer was already making friends with other moms in the neighborhood. The house needed some updates, but they were minor. Fresh paint, new fixtures, nothing major. Then, about 3 months in, Jennifer started to notice that Harold seemed to be outside a lot. Every time she looked out the window, he was there, puttering in his garden, washing his already clean car, sitting on his porch with a newspaper. It seemed like more than coincidence. One Saturday morning, Jennifer was in the kitchen making breakfast when she glanced out the window and saw Harold standing at the fence that separated their properties. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing their house. When he noticed Jennifer looking at him, he gave a little wave and went back to his gardening. Jennifer mentioned it to Michael that evening. "Don't you think Harold is outside a lot?" Michael shrugged. "He's retired. Probably bored. I'm sure it's nothing." But Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She started paying more attention, and the more she watched, the more uncomfortable she became. Harold did seem to be outside whenever she or the kids were. When the kids played in the backyard, Harold would be in his yard, always finding some reason to be near the fence. When Jennifer went to get the mail, Harold would emerge from his house at almost the exact same time. Felt like he was tracking them. Jennifer tried to tell herself she was being paranoid, but the feeling only grew stronger. She started keeping a mental log of Harold's appearances, and the pattern was undeniable. He was always there, always watching. Things escalated one afternoon when Jennifer was helping Emma with her homework at the kitchen table. She looked up and saw Harold standing in his upstairs window, which faced directly into their kitchen. He was just standing there, motionless, staring into their house. When Jennifer stood up and moved to close the curtain, Harold quickly stepped back from the window and disappeared. That night, Jennifer told Michael about it with more urgency. "This isn't normal, Michael. He's watching us. I want to put up some curtains or blinds or something." Michael agreed to install curtains in the rooms that faced the Richardsons' house, but he still thought Jennifer was overreacting. "He's just a bored old man. Probably doesn't even realize he's making you uncomfortable." The curtains helped Jennifer feel a bit better, but the unease didn't go away. Because now, with the curtains closed, she couldn't see what Harold was doing. Was he still watching? What was he looking at when they weren't looking back? Then Emma said something that made Jennifer's blood run cold. "Mommy, why does Mr. Harold take pictures of our house?" Jennifer put down the dish she was washing and turned to her daughter. "What do you mean, honey?" "Yesterday when I was playing outside, I saw Mr. Harold taking pictures of our house with a camera. A big one." Jennifer's heart started to race. "Did he take pictures of you?" Emma thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe." He had the camera pointed at the yard. Jennifer immediately went to find Michael, who was in his home office. She told him what Emma had said, and for the first time Michael looked concerned. "Taking pictures? That's weird. Maybe he's into photography and was shooting the houses or something." "Michael, he was taking pictures of our house while our daughter was playing in the yard. That's not okay." Michael agreed to talk to Harold about it. That evening he went over to the Richardsons' house and knocked on the door. Harold answered, smiling pleasantly. "Hey Harold. Sorry to bother you, but Emma mentioned that she saw you taking pictures of our house yesterday?" Harold's smile didn't waver. "Oh yes. I've been documenting the neighborhood. Just a little project to show how the area has changed over the years. I have photos going back decades." "Right, but could you maybe not take pictures when the kids are outside?" It makes Jennifer a little uncomfortable. Something flickered in Harold's eyes, annoyance maybe or anger, but his smile remained in place. "Of course. I certainly didn't mean to cause any concern. My apologies." Michael returned home feeling like the situation had been resolved, but Jennifer wasn't so sure. There was something about Harold's smile and Michael's description that bothered her. It sounded fake. Over the next few weeks, Jennifer became increasingly paranoid about the Richardsons. She found herself constantly looking out windows, checking to see if Harold was there. And he always was. Even after Michael's talk with him, Harold continued his pattern of being outside whenever they were, always finding some task that required him to be near the fence, near their property. Jennifer started closing all the curtains in the house during the day, even though it made the interior dark and depressing. The kids started asking why they had to keep the curtains closed, and Jennifer didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that you think the neighbor is watching you without terrifying them? Then one night everything changed. Jennifer woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. As she was walking back to bed, she noticed a strange light flickering across the wall of the hallway. She walked to Tyler's room, where the light seemed to be coming from, and peered through a crack in the curtains. Her heart nearly stopped. In the upstairs window of the Richardsons' house, the window that faced directly into Tyler's bedroom, there was a faint blue glow. As Jennifer's eyes adjusted, she could make out a shape. It was Harold, sitting in a chair in the darkened room, and in front of him was some kind of device, a screen or a monitor glowing blue in the darkness. And he was staring at it, completely motionless in the middle of the night. Jennifer quickly closed the curtain and stood there, shaking. What was he doing up at 2 a.m., sitting in the dark, looking at a screen that faced her son's bedroom? The answer that came to her was too horrible to fully process. She woke Michael up and told him what she'd seen. Michael was groggy and confused, but when Jennifer insisted they go look, he followed her to Tyler's room. She carefully pulled back the curtain just an inch. Harold was still there, still sitting in the same position, his face illuminated by the blue glow. "What the hell is he doing?" Michael whispered. They watched for a few minutes, and then they saw something that confirmed Jennifer's worst fear. Harold reached forward and adjusted something on the device in front of him. He was moving it, angling it like he was controlling a camera. "Oh my God," Jennifer breathed. "Michael, I think he has cameras pointed at our house." Michael's face went pale. No way. That can't be." But even as he said it, Jennifer could see the realization dawning on him. All those times Harold had been outside. His constant presence near their property. The photography. His upstairs window that faced directly into their home. "We need to call the police," Jennifer said. "Right now." The police arrived within 20 minutes. Jennifer and Michael showed them what they'd seen, and the officers went to the Richardsons' house. It was nearly 3 a.m. by this point, and the officers had to pound on the door for several minutes before Harold finally answered, acting confused and sleepy. The police told him there had been a complaint about possible surveillance equipment, and they asked if they could look at his upstairs room. Harold, perhaps still disoriented from sleep, or perhaps confident that he hadn't technically broken any laws, allowed them in. What they found was nightmare fuel. Harold's upstairs room, which he'd told Diane was just a hobby room where he worked on his photography, was something else entirely. The walls were lined with monitors, 7 of them total. 4 of the monitors showed live feeds of the Henderson house. The cameras were positioned to capture different angles: the backyard, the kitchen window, the driveway, and Tyler's bedroom window. 3 other monitors showed recorded footage, organized into folders by date and time. But it wasn't just cameras. On a desk in the corner was a detailed log, a notebook where Harold had been recording the Henderson family's daily activities. What time Michael left for work, when the kids went to school, when Jennifer left the house and when she returned, what they wore, what they ate if he could see it through the windows. Everything. One wall had a large calendar with the family schedule mapped out: doctor's appointments, Emma's soccer practices, Tyler's piano lessons. Somehow Harold had figured out their entire routine. The police officers, both veterans with years of experience, were visibly shaken by what they'd found. They immediately called for backup and detectives. Harold was taken into custody, and Diane, who claimed she had no idea what her husband had been doing in that room, was questioned extensively. As the sun rose that morning, Jennifer and Michael sat in their living room with a female detective who specialized in stalking cases. She told them that Harold Richardson had been surveilling their family for at least 2 months, possibly longer. The cameras had been hidden in his window frames, disguised to look like ordinary equipment, and pointed through the glass at strategic angles. The good news is that the cameras only captured external views and what could be seen through your windows, the detective said. He didn't plant any devices in your home as far as we can tell. But we're going to do a full sweep to make sure. What about Tyler's bedroom? Jennifer asked, her voice shaking. That camera was pointed right at his room. The detective's expression was grim. Mr. Richardson's curtains were usually closed just enough that the camera had a limited view. We've reviewed some of the footage, and it appears he could only see Tyler's window when the curtains were open, and even then only partially. There's no evidence of any inappropriate content on his computers or drives. Jennifer started crying. Even partially was too much. Even the thought of that man watching her baby boy sleep, documenting when he was in his room, was more than she could bear. The detective continued, Mr. Richardson's attorney will likely argue that he wasn't recording any areas where you had a reasonable expectation of privacy, and technically that's true. The cameras were on his property, recording things visible from his property. But the stalking, the logs, the obsessive documentation, that's absolutely criminal. He'll be charged with stalking, harassment, and we're investigating whether any other charges apply. Over the following days, the full scope of Harold's surveillance came to light. The folders of recorded footage went back 4 months, starting just a week after the Hendersons had moved in. Detectives estimated he'd recorded hundreds of hours of footage of the family. The notebook logs were even more disturbing. Harold had written observations about each family member. Jennifer home alone 9:15 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Exercise clothes. Usually showers after. Emma leaves soccer practice at 6 p.m. Carries pink backpack. Always thirsty after practice. Michael returns from work between 6:30 and 7 p.m. Looks tired. Often argues with Jennifer in kitchen around 8 p.m. Tyler afraid of dark. Night light on until approximately 10 p.m. The logs revealed an obsessive knowledge of their private lives, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Reading them made Jennifer feel physically ill. Perhaps most chilling was a section in the notebook titled Vulnerabilities, where Harold had documented the times when each family member was alone and where the locations of their spare keys. He'd watched Jennifer hide one under a planter, and what appeared to be detailed notes on the family's home security system, when it was armed, when it wasn't, and the blind spots where the motion sensors didn't reach. The detective told them it looked like Harold might have been planning something beyond just watching. The level of detail, especially about their security system and when people were home alone, suggested he might have been preparing to take his obsession to the next level. We may have caught this just in time, the detective said quietly. When asked why he'd done it, Harold had told the police that he'd simply wanted to watch over the neighborhood. He claimed he was trying to keep everyone safe, that his surveillance was for their protection. He seemed genuinely confused about why everyone was so upset. A psychiatric evaluation later revealed that Harold had developed an obsessive-compulsive disorder in retirement, and his fixation on the Hendersons was a manifestation of intrusive thoughts that he'd been unable to control. The psychiatrist also noted narcissistic tendencies and a disturbing lack of empathy for his victims' privacy and autonomy. None of that made Jennifer feel any better. The diagnosis didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the violation they felt. The Hendersons couldn't stay in that house. Every time Jennifer looked out the window, she saw those cameras. Every time she put the kids to bed, she thought about that blue glow in the middle of the night, Harold sitting in the darkness watching their home. The house that had been their dream had turned into a nightmare. They put the house on the market and moved in with Jennifer's parents while they searched for a new place. They eventually found a house in a different suburb, on a corner lot with no immediate neighbors on either side. Harold Richardson was convicted of stalking, criminal surveillance, and harassment. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and issued a permanent restraining order against the Henderson family. Diane divorced him before the trial ended. But the damage to the Hendersons was done. Emma started having nightmares about the man in the window. Tyler became anxious whenever they drove past a house that looked similar to their old one. Michael developed trust issues, finding it difficult to be friendly with new neighbors. And Jennifer developed a form of PTSD that made it hard for her to feel safe anywhere. Their therapist told them that the violation of being surveilled in your own home is a unique kind of trauma. Your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, the one place where you can let your guard down and be completely yourself. When someone invades that space, even just with cameras, it shatters your sense of security in a fundamental way. The question that haunted Jennifer most was, why them? What had they done to attract Harold's attention? The answer, according to the prosecutor, was nothing. They'd simply been a young family who moved in next door to a man with an obsession and too much time on his hands. They were victims of circumstance, wrong place, wrong time. But Jennifer also wondered about the families who'd lived in their house before them. Had Harold watched them too? The police investigated this and found that Harold's hobby room had been set up for at least 5 years, possibly longer. The previous occupants of the Henderson house had been an elderly single woman who'd lived there for decades. She'd passed away, which was why the house had been for sale. Before her, records showed a series of different owners throughout the years. Had Harold been watching all of them? Or was there something specific about the Hendersons, a young family with small children, that had triggered his obsession? These were questions that would never be fully answered. Today, the Henderson family is healing slowly. They've been in their new house for over a year now, and some days are better than others. They have extensive security measures, cameras of their own. The irony isn't lost on Jennifer. Alarm systems, privacy fences, and curtains on every window. Emma's nightmares have decreased in frequency. Tyler is doing better, though he still insists on sleeping with his curtains tightly closed. Michael has learned to chat casually with their new neighbors while maintaining careful boundaries. And Jennifer is working with her therapist to rebuild her sense of safety. But none of them will ever fully get over what Harold Richardson did to them. Because he didn't just watch them, he took away something precious. He took away their ability to feel completely safe in their own home, to live their lives without wondering if someone might be watching, documenting, learning their patterns, finding their vulnerabilities. And that's a theft that can never be fully recovered from. Because once you know that evil can live right next door, hiding behind a pleasant smile and a casserole dish, wearing the mask of a friendly neighbor, you can never unknow it. The Hendersons learned that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that break down your door in the middle of the night. They're the ones who wave at you from across the fence, who watch you through your windows, who learn your schedule and your habits, and who wait, and wait, and wait. Story 3, The Ritual Upstairs. College student David Park thought he'd hit the jackpot when he found an affordable one-bedroom apartment just 3 blocks from the University of Washington campus in Seattle. It was rare to find anything decent in the University district at a price he could afford, even with his part-time job at the campus bookstore. The apartment was on the second floor of a converted house. It was small but clean, with hardwood floors and decent natural light. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Kozlov who spoke with a thick Russian accent, seemed eager to rent it. "Good place for student," Mr. Kozlov had said during the showing. "Quiet. No problems." When David asked about the other tenants, Mr. Kozlov had waved his hand dismissively. "Other units have people, but everyone keep to themselves. Very quiet building." David moved in during the late summer before his junior year. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. He rarely saw his neighbors. There was an older woman in the apartment below his who he'd see occasionally taking out her trash, always nodding politely but never speaking. And upstairs, on the third floor, someone lived in what Mr. Kozlov had told him was a converted attic apartment, but David never saw them. The first sign that something was off came about 3 weeks after David moved in. He was up late studying for a chemistry exam. It was around 1 a.m. when he heard a sound from the apartment above. At first, it was just footsteps, nothing unusual. People walk around their apartments. But these footsteps were strange. They moved in a deliberate pattern. 3 steps forward, pause, 3 steps back, pause, 3 steps to the left, pause, 3 steps to the right, pause. Then the pattern would repeat. David looked up at his ceiling, listening. The footsteps continued in the same pattern for about 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. He went back to studying, but he couldn't concentrate. Something about those footsteps had been deeply unsettling. The mechanical precision of them, the strange pattern, it didn't feel like someone just walking around their apartment. It felt ritualistic. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Every night, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., the pattern would begin. 3 steps forward, pause, 3 steps back, pause, 3 steps left, pause, 3 steps right, pause. Repeat. It would go on for anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour, then stop. David tried to ignore it. He put on headphones, played white noise, tried to time his sleep schedule to be asleep before it started. But once you knew it was coming, it was impossible not to listen for it. And something about the ritualistic nature of it made it impossible to dismiss as just a weird neighbor with insomnia. After about a week of this, David decided to mention it to his downstairs neighbor. He caught her one morning as she was checking her mailbox. "Excuse me," David said. "I'm David from the second floor. I was wondering if you've ever heard strange sounds from the apartment upstairs." The woman's expression changed instantly. Her face went pale and she looked quickly up at the third-floor windows, then back at David. "You hear it too?" she whispered. "The footsteps?" "Yeah, every night. It's this weird pattern." "Don't talk about it out here," the woman interrupted, glancing around nervously. "Come to my apartment." Confused but intrigued, David followed her inside. Her apartment was cluttered but cozy, filled with plants and old furniture. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chin and immediately went to make tea, her hands shaking slightly. "How long have you been hearing it?" she asked. "About a week." "What's going on? Who lives up there?" Mrs. Chin set down 2 cups of tea and sat across from David. "His name is Anton Volkov. He's been there for almost 2 years. I've been here for 5 years and he's the 3rd person to live in that apartment during my time here." "Okay, so what's the deal with the footsteps?" Mrs. Chen took a sip of her tea, gathering her thoughts. The footsteps started about 6 months after he moved in. At first, it was just occasional, maybe once or twice a week. But over time, it became every night. Always the same pattern. Always between midnight and 2 a.m. "Have you talked to him about it?" "I tried once. I knocked on his door one evening around 6 p.m. He answered, but he only opened the door a crack. I could barely see him. I asked him politely if he could try to be quieter at night, and he just stared at me. Didn't say a word. Just stared. Then he closed the door in my face." David felt a chill run down his spine. "That's weird." "That's not even the strangest part," Mrs. Chin continued. "Sometimes late at night I hear other sounds. Chanting. In a language I don't recognize. And once I smelled something burning, not like food burning but something chemical, acrid. It made my eyes water even though it was coming from upstairs." "Jesus. Have you told the landlord?" Mrs. Chen laughed bitterly. "Mr. Kozlov? He doesn't care. I've complained multiple times. He just says that as long as the rent is paid, he doesn't interfere with tenants. Anton always pays his rent on time, apparently. David left Mrs. Chen's apartment feeling unsettled. He decided to do some investigating of his own. That evening, around 11:30 p.m., he quietly climbed the stairs to the third floor and stood outside Anton's door listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, at precisely midnight, David watched the seconds tick over on his phone. He heard movement inside. Not footsteps yet, but the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then silence for a few minutes. Then the footsteps began. 3 forward, pause, 3 back, pause, 3 left, pause, 3 right, pause. But now, being this close to the source, David could hear something else. A low murmuring voice speaking in rhythm with the steps. The words were in a language David didn't recognize, guttural and harsh. David stood there, frozen, listening. His rational mind told him to just go back to his apartment, put on his headphones and ignore it. But something else, curiosity, morbid fascination, kept him rooted to the spot. After about 5 minutes, the pattern changed. The footsteps became faster, more erratic. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. Then there was a sound that made David's blood run cold, a sound like meat slapping against the floor, wet and heavy. David's nerve broke. He hurried back downstairs to his apartment, locked the door, and for the first time since moving in, he felt genuinely afraid. Over the next few weeks, David became obsessed with figuring out what Anton was doing up there. He started researching online, trying to find information about ritualistic patterns, strange chanting, the specific footstep sequences. He found references to various occult practices, ceremonial magic, shamanic rituals, but nothing that quite matched what he was hearing. He also started paying attention to Anton's comings and goings. He noticed that Anton only seemed to leave his apartment twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, always around 3 p.m., always returning around 5 p.m. He was tall and extremely thin with long dark hair and pale skin. He always wore the same long black coat even when it was warm out. And he always carried 2 large canvas bags, the kind you'd use for groceries. But when Anton returned, the bags seemed even heavier than when he'd left. They bulged oddly, and whatever was in them seemed to shift and move. Once, David watched from his window as Anton climbed the exterior stairs to the 3rd floor, and one of the bags tore slightly. Something dark and wet leaked out, leaving a trail on the stairs. David felt sick. What the hell was in those bags? The nightly rituals were getting worse too. The footsteps were now accompanied by other sounds, scratching like fingernails on wood, low moaning, and occasionally a sound that resembled crying or whimpering, though David couldn't tell if it was human or animal. The smell Mrs. Chen had mentioned became more frequent too. At least once a week, a horrible stench would seep down through David's ceiling. Something rotten and chemical at the same time, like decomposing meat mixed with ammonia. It made David gag, and he'd have to open all his windows, even in the cold Seattle rain. David tried to talk to Mr. Kozlov again, calling him multiple times, but the landlord was always evasive. If he's breaking lease, you show me proof. Otherwise, I don't interfere. One night, about 2 months after David had moved in, something happened that changed everything. David was in bed, trying to sleep despite the footsteps and chanting above him, when suddenly there was a loud crash from upstairs, followed by a scream. Not a horror movie scream, but a real scream of genuine terror and pain. Then more crashes, the sound of furniture breaking, and something that sounded like a struggle. David jumped out of bed and grabbed his phone, ready to call 911. But then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. David stood in his dark bedroom, heart pounding, phone in hand, staring at the ceiling. Should he call the police? Should he go check on Anton? What the hell had just happened? He was still debating what to do when he heard footsteps above him, but not the usual ritualistic pattern. These were frantic, running footsteps, moving from one end of the apartment to the other. Then he heard Anton's door open and footsteps thundering down the stairs. David ran to his door and looked through the peephole. He saw Anton rush past, still in the long black coat, but now he was carrying something wrapped in a sheet or blanket. Something large and heavy that he was struggling to carry. Anton disappeared down the stairs, and David heard the front door of the building slam shut. For a long moment, David stood there, breathing hard, trying to decide what to do. Then he made a decision that he would later recognize as probably the stupidest of his life. He decided to go upstairs and look into Anton's apartment. He grabbed a flashlight and his phone, made sure 911 was ready to dial with one touch, and quietly made his way up to the third floor. Anton's door was slightly ajar, which was strange. Anton always kept his door closed and locked. David pushed it open slowly and the smell hit him immediately, that horrible rotting chemical smell, but 100 times worse. He gagged and pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth. "Hello?" he called out weakly. No response. He stepped inside and turned on his flashlight. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The apartment was almost completely empty of furniture. No couch, no TV, no normal apartment things. Instead, the floor was covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like chalk or paint. Circles within circles, strange characters and sigils that David didn't recognize. Candles were everywhere, dozens of them, burned down to various levels. In the center of the main room was a large circle marked on the floor, about 6 feet in diameter. Inside the circle were the remains of something. Bones. Animal bones, David hoped desperately, but some of them looked disturbingly large. There were also other objects. Feathers, bits of fur, what might have been teeth, and jars filled with dark liquids. But what made David's stomach turn was the far wall. It was covered, floor to ceiling, with photographs. Hundreds of them, all showing the same thing. People sleeping. Different people in different rooms, all photographed from above, as if the photographer had been standing over them while they slept. Men, women, even children. All vulnerable, all unaware. And in the corner of each photograph was a number written in red. Some numbers were single digits, others were higher. The highest David saw was 47. His hands shaking, David took out his phone and started taking pictures of everything. The symbols, the circle, the wall of photographs. He needed evidence. He needed proof that something deeply wrong was happening here. That's when he heard footsteps on the stairs outside. Anton was coming back. Panic surged through David. He was in Anton's apartment, had broken in, sort of, and had no good explanation for being there. He looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the apartment was almost empty. The only option was a small closet near the entrance. David squeezed into the closet, pulling the door almost closed, leaving just a crack to see through. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure Anton would hear it. The apartment door opened fully and Anton walked in, dragging something behind him. No, not something, someone. A person wrapped in a sheet, unconscious or possibly dead. David felt his blood turn to ice. He watched through the crack in the closet door as Anton dragged the body into the center of the ritual circle. He unwrapped the sheet, revealing a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with short blonde hair. She was wearing pajamas, and David realized with horror that she'd been taken from her bed, just like all those photographs on the wall. The woman was breathing. She was alive but unconscious. Anton began moving around the circle, lighting the candles that had gone out, muttering in that strange language. David knew he should call the police right now, but he was terrified that if his phone made any sound, Anton would find him. And he had no doubt that if Anton found him, David would end up in that circle too. Anton's chanting grew louder, more intense. He pulled out a large knife from his coat, not a kitchen knife, but something ceremonial with strange carvings on the blade. David's finger hovered over the emergency call button on his phone. He had to do something. He couldn't just watch this woman die. But before Anton could use the knife, the woman's eyes suddenly snapped open. She saw Anton standing over her with the knife and let out a blood-curdling scream. She tried to get up, to run, but she was disoriented and stumbled. That moment of chaos was all David needed. He burst out of the closet and tackled Anton, knocking the knife from his hand. Anton was thin but surprisingly strong, and they struggled on the floor, crashing through the candles, smearing the chalk symbols. "Run!" David screamed at the woman. "Get out and call the police." The woman scrambled to her feet and ran for the door, still screaming. David heard her footsteps thundering down the stairs, heard her screaming for help. Anton's face was inches from David's now, and what David saw there would fuel his nightmares for years to come. Anton's eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, as if they'd been filled with ink. And he was smiling, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "You've ruined everything," Anton hissed in perfect English, his voice layered as if multiple people were speaking at once. 2 years of work, 2 years of preparation. I was so close. David managed to knee Anton in the stomach and break free. He scrambled toward the door, but Anton was faster than he should have been. He grabbed David's ankle and pulled him back, dragging him toward the circle. "You'll take her place," Anton said, that horrible multi-layered voice echoing in the empty apartment. "The ritual demands completion. It must have a vessel." David kicked frantically, his shoe connecting with Anton's face. He heard a crunch and Anton released him, clutching his nose. David didn't wait. He ran for the door and down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. He burst out of the building into the cool night air to find the woman collapsed on the sidewalk, Mrs. Chin standing over her with a phone pressed to her ear. The old woman must have heard the screams and come outside. "Police are coming," Mrs. Chin said, her voice shaking. "I heard everything. What's happening up there?" David looked back at the building, at the third-floor windows. A pale face looked down at them, Anton watching from his window, still smiling that horrible smile. "We need to go," David said urgently. "We need to get away from the building. Now." They helped the woman to her feet and moved across the street just as they heard sirens approaching. 3 police cars arrived within minutes, followed shortly by an ambulance. David told the officers everything: the nightly rituals, the photographs, the circle, the attack. The woman, whose name was Rachel Thornton, confirmed that she'd been asleep in her apartment 4 blocks away when she woke up being dragged across the floor of a strange apartment. She had no memory of how she'd been taken from her home. The police went up to Anton's apartment, but the door was locked and there was no response to their knocking. They got Mr. Kozlov to bring the master key and open the door. The apartment was empty. Anton was gone. But everything else was still there: the symbols, the ritual circle, the bones, the wall of photographs. The officers who first entered came back out looking shaken, and more units were called in. Over the next several hours, as David, Mrs. Chin, and Rachel gave their statements, the full horror of what Anton Volkov had been doing became clear. The photographs on the wall weren't random. Each one showed a victim, people Anton had been stalking, entering their homes while they slept, photographing them, preparing them for his ritual. The numbers in the corners weren't random either. They represented the order in which Anton planned to take them. Rachel Thornton was number 47. The police found her apartment unlocked, her bedroom window open. Anton had somehow known she lived alone, known her schedule, known exactly when she'd be most vulnerable. And she wasn't the first. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that over the previous year, there had been reports of several people in the university district waking up feeling drugged or disoriented, with no memory of portions of the night. Some reported small injuries they couldn't explain or strange marks on their bodies. At the time, these reports had been filed away as possible cases of date rape, drugs, or alcohol poisoning. Now the police realized these had likely been Anton's earlier attempts, practicing his technique of drugging and abducting victims. The bones in the circle were sent for analysis. The results came back showing they were from multiple sources: various animals, but also several human bones that appeared to be very old, possibly purchased illegally or stolen from a medical facility or burial site. A forensic anthropologist brought in to examine the ritual setup explained that the symbols and patterns matched several different occult traditions, a mishmash of ceremonial magic, Slavic folk rituals, and what appeared to be Anton's own inventions. It seemed he'd been trying to perform some kind of summoning or transformation ritual, and he believed he needed human subjects, living human subjects, to complete it. The investigation expanded nationally. Anton Volkov's fingerprints and DNA were in the system. He'd been arrested in New York 3 years earlier for breaking into a woman's home but had been released on a technicality. Before that, there were reports from Chicago, from Boston, from several other cities of similar break-ins, stalking cases, and strange ritual setups found in abandoned buildings. Anton Volkov wasn't just a one-time offender. He was a serial predator who'd been moving from city to city, refining his ritual, getting bolder each time. Despite a massive manhunt, Anton Volkov was never found. He disappeared into the night like smoke, leaving behind only his ritual room and dozens of terrified potential victims who now knew they'd been marked, photographed, stalked. Rachel Thornton underwent therapy for PTSD and eventually moved to another state to live with family. Mrs. Chen moved out of the building within a month. She couldn't stand living there anymore, knowing what had been happening right above her. The building itself developed a reputation and several other tenants moved out. Mr. Kozlov tried to rent out the third-floor apartment but couldn't find anyone willing to take it. As for David, he finished the semester but then transferred to a different university in California. He couldn't stay in Seattle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Anton's face, those black eyes, that horrible smile. He heard that multi-layered voice saying, "You'll take her place." The therapist David started seeing told him he'd experienced a severe trauma and that what he was feeling, the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the constant sense of being watched, was a normal response to an abnormal situation. But knowing it was normal didn't make it any easier to deal with. What haunted David most wasn't even the night of the attack. It was the 2 months before it. 2 months of hearing those footsteps, those rituals, those sounds, and doing nothing. 2 months when Anton was stalking 47 different people, planning their abductions, refining his technique. 2 months when David could have pushed harder, could have called the police himself, could have done more than just complain to the landlord. His therapist told him this was survivor's guilt, that he couldn't have known what was really happening, that he'd ultimately saved a woman's life. But David couldn't shake the question. How many of those 47 people had Anton gotten to before Rachel? How many had been taken, drugged, used in his rituals, and then let go with hazy memories and unexplained marks? How many might have been harmed in ways that were never reported or recognized? The police assured David that they'd interviewed every person they could identify from the photographs, and while many reported strange experiences, none could definitively say they'd been abducted and used in a ritual. It seemed Rachel Thornton was going to be Anton's first complete ritual, whatever that meant. But that's what the police knew. What about the things they didn't know? What about the victims before Seattle, in all those other cities where Anton had left a trail of break-ins and strange incidents? These were the questions that kept David awake at night in his new apartment in California, where he'd installed multiple locks on every door and window, where he slept with his phone clutched in his hand, ready to call 911 at a moment's notice, where every footstep from the apartment above sent a jolt of fear through his system. The worst part was knowing that Anton Volkov was still out there, somewhere. The FBI had him on their most wanted list. His picture was circulated to police departments nationwide. But the country is vast, and a person who wants to disappear can disappear, especially someone who'd already proven adept at moving from place to place, creating new identities, finding new victims. David sometimes wondered if Anton had completed his ritual somewhere else, in another city with another victim. He wondered what the ritual was even for. What was Anton trying to summon or become? The occult experts the police consulted had theories, but no definitive answers. Some thought Anton was trying to summon an entity or demon. Others thought he was attempting some kind of spiritual transformation or immortality ritual. A few thought he was simply mentally ill, creating elaborate fantasies and rituals that had no basis in any real occult tradition. But David, who'd looked into those black eyes, who'd heard that multi-layered voice, who'd felt the unnatural strength in Anton's thin frame, wasn't so sure it was just mental illness. He'd felt something in that apartment, something wrong on a fundamental level, like the air itself was tainted with malevolence. 6 months after the incident, David received a package at his new address in California. There was no return address, just his name and address written in spidery handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of David sleeping in his new apartment in his new bed taken from above. In the corner, written in red, was a number, 48. David immediately called the police and the FBI. They took the photograph as evidence, increased patrols around his building, and added extra details to Anton's file. They assured David they would catch Anton eventually. But David knew the truth. Anton had found him, had followed him across state lines, had broken into his new apartment while David slept, had stood over him, just like he'd stood over all those other victims and taken his photograph. David was number 48. And someday when Anton was ready, when he prepared enough, when the stars aligned or the moon was right or whatever conditions his insane ritual required, Anton would come back for him. That's why David never sleeps in the same place 2 nights in a row now. Why he's always moving, always looking over his shoulder, always keeping his bag packed and ready by the door. Why he's learned self-defense, bought weapons he prays he'll never have to use, and created an elaborate alert system that will warn him if anyone enters his current residence. Because David learned something that most people, thankfully, will never have to learn. Sometimes the monsters are real. Sometimes they live in the apartment upstairs. They walk past you on the street. They stand over you while you sleep. And sometimes, once they've marked you as their victim, there's nowhere you can run that will keep you safe forever. Because they're patient, they're persistent, and they never, ever forget. Conclusion. 3 stories. 3 families whose lives were shattered by the people living next door. Sarah Mitchell, who discovered her neighbor had been living a secret life inside her apartment. The Henderson family, who were surveilled and stalked by the retired man next door. And David Park, who found himself marked as victim number 48 by a predator performing dark rituals in the apartment above. These stories are real. The names have been changed to protect the victim's privacy, but the events happened. They serve as a chilling reminder that we never truly know the people we live near. That pleasant smile across the fence, that friendly wave in the hallway, that quiet neighbor who keeps to themselves. Behind any of these could be something far darker than we want to imagine. If you've experienced anything similar, if you feel watched in your own home, if things move when you're not there, if your neighbor's behavior seems off in ways you can't quite articulate, trust your instincts. Document everything. Install cameras. Contact the police. Don't dismiss your gut feelings as paranoia. Sarah Mitchell, the Hendersons, and David Park all felt that something was wrong long before they had proof. They all wished they'd acted sooner. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Which of these 3 stories disturbed you the most? Have you ever had a creepy neighbor experience? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else realize they're not alone or validate their own suspicions. If you enjoyed this deep dive into true horror, make sure you're subscribed to Dark Whispers with notifications turned on. We bring you real horror stories every week. The kind of tales that remind us that the scariest monsters don't live in movies or books. They live in our world, walking among us, sometimes right next door. And remember, the next time you hear strange sounds from your neighbor's apartment, or notice them watching you just a little too intently, or feel that creeping sensation that something isn't quite right, pay attention. Because in the real world, unlike in movies, there's no background music to warn you when the monster is near. Stay safe out there. Lock your doors. Trust your instincts. And maybe, just maybe, get to know your neighbors a little better, from a safe distance, of course. This is Dark Whispers, reminding you that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happen. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.